Today we're going to talk pedigrees. Now, pedigrees are going to be our last mini unit before we move on to a completely new topic, and that topic will be evolution. So, pedigrees will be rounding out our genetics unit, and it ties together everything that we learn with regards to dominance, recessiveness, Punnett squares. So it's a perfect way to end our genetics unit. So the goals of pedigree analysis, when you're looking at a pedigree, you're able to determine whether or not the trait is located on an autosome or a sex chromosome. So is the gene located on an autosome, chromosomes numbers 1 through 22, or is the gene located on a sex chromosome, either the X chromosome or the Y chromosome? Now recall that females have two X chromosomes and males have an X and a Y chromosome. So autosomal traits are genes that are not located on a sex chromosome, and then there are sex-linked traits, either X-linked, meaning that the gene is found on the X chromosome, or Y-linked, meaning that the gene is found on the Y chromosome. Pretty much all of the X-linked traits that we are going to talk about and that we have talked about are recessive, which means that sons will inherit the disease, the trait, the disorder, whatever it is, from their mom, who might be a carrier. And then Y-linked traits, or genes found only on the Y chromosome, can only be expressed by males. Also, looking at a pedigree, you can determine how the trait is expressed. So is the trait being expressed in the dominant fashion? If that's the case, you'll find that the trait is expressed in almost every generation of a pedigree. Or is the trait recessive? If the trait is recessive, then you're going to find that the trait tends to skip generations within a pedigree. And then ultimately, you're going to be able to determine the probability of having an affected offspring for a given cross. So if you're tracing colorblindness in a family, you will ultimately be able to figure out the genotypes of those individuals and then predict what the possible outcome is of a genetic cross using a Punnett square. So pedigree charts very basically are family trees that indicate the phenotype of one trait being studied for every member of the family. So a pedigree chart looks specifically at one trait. So whether that trait be eye color, whether that trait be tongue rolling, or whether that trait be color blindness, you're only looking at one trait in a pedigree. And a pedigree is used to determine how a particular trait is inherited. Again, is that trait autosomal? Is that trait found on a sex chromosome? Is that trait expressed dominantly, or is that trait expressed recessively? That's how we determine how a particular trait is inherited. Couple things I want to point out on this pedigree is you will notice that each sort of row is labeled by a Roman numeral, okay? So this Roman numeral indicates generation. Okay, so Roman numeral 1 equals generation number 1, Roman numeral number 2, generation 2, generation 3. Okay, and you can see moving from left to right across the screen, we have numbers indicating the individuals within that generation. So if I wanted to specify a particular individual in a pedigree and I wrote generation number 2, individual number 5, okay, I would be referring to that individual right there. So when constructing a pedigree, you want to make sure that you label your generations. You also want to make sure that you number the individuals in each generation moving from left to right, so that when you refer to a particular individual in a pedigree, you can do so using this type of notation. So let's take a closer look at the different patterns of inheritance that we can see in pedigrees. Oh, basic symbols. Before we get to patterns of inheritance, we need to talk about basic symbols. So here we go. An unaffected male is a unshaded square. An unaffected female is an unshaded circle. So, in a nutshell, males are squares, females are circles. If an individual has a particular trait, again, if that's for eye color, tongue rolling, or color blindness, if that individual has a particular trait, they're going to be shaded in. So as you can see here, this is a shaded in square, this is a shaded in circle. Those individuals are affected by whatever particular trait you are examining. A diamond is a person whose sex is not known. This is pretty uncommon, but it might be used if, let's say, a woman is pregnant and she doesn't yet know the sex of her offspring. A horizontal line between a circle and a square indicates a mating or a marriage. Okay, two horizontal lines between a male and a female, this indicates a consanguous marriage. Again, you're not going to see too many of these. What consanguous marriages are a marriage between within the bloodline. So that means that siblings marrying siblings, individuals marrying cousins. So you're marrying within your bloodline. Again, not very common. Where you do find consanguous marriages is in the pedigrees of the royal families from way back in Renaissance times and stuff like that, because royals were only allowed to marry other royals, so they had a very limited pool of individuals who they could marry. So you'll find like Queen Victoria and other, of the royal families, they would marry cousins and things like that. So their pedigrees are rife with consanguous marriages. A vertical line coming off a horizontal line indicates an offspring. So right here we've got a family of 6, father, mother, and then they have 1, 2, 3, 4 children. This right here is identifying non-identical twins. And identical twins, as you can see here, there would be a line coming down, and of course identical twins are of the same sex. One additional symbol I would like you to add, either a circle or a square with a line through it like so, indicates deceased or a death. So that means that that individual is no longer living. So these are basic symbols that you're going to be familiar with, or you need to be familiar with when looking at pedigrees. There are tons more, and if we come across them as we go through pedigrees, I will explain them. So let's now take a look at inheritance patterns. So when solving pedigree problems, there are certain steps that you need to take in order to solve the pedigree, meaning determining the pattern of inheritance. Is it autosomal? Is it X-linked? Is it Y-linked? Is it dominant, or is it recessive? So first things first, start at the bottom. You need to read your pedigree from the bottom up. Okay, so you're reading the pedigree from the bottom up. So you're starting at, if there's 3 generations in a pedigree, you're starting at the 3rd generation and you're working your way up. That's the first step. Second step, you're only looking at the shaded individuals, or you're only looking at the affected individuals. Forget everybody else in the pedigree. Okay. Third step, you need to determine if the pedigree is autosomal, the gene is found on chromosomes 1 through 22, X-linked, is the gene found on the X chromosome, or Y-linked, is the gene only found on the Y chromosome. If the trait is autosomal, you will have approximately a 50-50 male to female ratio of affected individuals. What does that mean? That means that if you have 3 males shaded in and 3 females shaded in, it's most likely going to be autosomal. Or if you have more females shaded in than males, meaning you have 4 females shaded in and only 3 males shaded in, again, it's most likely going to be autosomal. Okay? If the trait is X-linked, meaning that it's found on the X chromosome, then you will usually find more males affected than females. This means that you will find maybe 3 males shaded in and 1 female, or you will find only males shaded in. If the trait is Y-linked, okay, you are only going to find males affected or only going to find males shaded in. And you need to take a closer look at this pedigree because, again, a Y-linked trait is going to be passed down from father to son, so on and so forth. So if a male marries into the family, they might not be shaded in. So in Y-linked inheritance, you have to take a closer look at this pedigree because not all the males are going to be shaded in, only the males of a specific bloodline will be affected by the trait. Once you've determined whether or not a pedigree is autosomal, X-linked, or Y-linked, you now need to determine whether or not the pedigree is either dominant or whether or not the trait is dominant or recessive. If the trait is dominant, okay, take a look at any affected individual, any individual that is shaded in. Then take a look at their parents. If you take a look at their parents, at least one of their parents is also going to be shaded in or affected as well. That means you're dealing with a dominant trait. Okay. If the trait is recessive, if you take a look at any affected individual, okay, and then take a look at their parents, you'll most likely find that their parents aren't affected at all. Okay, so this is what we call skipping a generation. So when you take a look at the pedigree as a whole, you will find that recessive traits tend to skip generations, meaning that you'll find affected individuals in generation number 1. You won't find any affected individuals in generation 2, but you will find affected individuals again in generation number 3. So recessive traits tend to skip generations, unlike dominant traits, which tend to appear in every single generation. You'll find affected individuals in the first generation, second generation, and third generation if you're dealing with a dominant trait. Once you've determined if the pedigree is dominant or recessive, you then need to go in and fill in the possible genotypes of the individuals in the pedigree. That's not something you need to worry about just yet. I'm going to show you how to do that in class. So interpreting a pedigree chart. Again, first things first is you're going to start at the bottom. Okay, then you're going to look at only the affected individuals. Again, you need to determine whether or not the trait is autosomal, whether it's X-linked, or whether it's Y-linked. I'm going to focus on only autosomal or X-linked because those are most frequent. Again, if the trait is autosomal, meaning it's found on chromosomes 1 through 22, you're going to have approximately a 50-50 ratio of males and females affected. That means you're going to have 3 males shaded in the pedigree and 3 females shaded in, or you're going to have 4 females shaded in and 3 males shaded in. So you'll either have a 50-50 ratio or you're going to have more females affected than males. If the gene is found on the X chromosome or the trait is found on the X chromosome, you're going to have more males affected than females. That's just the way it is. Then once you've determined that, you can go on to determine dominance or recessiveness. But before we get there, let's look at Y-linked. So Y-linked traits are traits found only on the Y chromosome. They're only found in males, not in females, because of course females don't have a Y chromosome. And the father's traits are passed down to all of the sons. So if you take a look at this pedigree, you have the father here, and he's passing his trait on to his son. You've got this individual here, and he's passing that trait on to his son. And if you take a look at these males over here, okay, you notice that they're not shaded in. In a Y-linked inheritance pedigree, okay, you have to look at the bloodline, okay? The trait is going to be passed down through the bloodline. Any individual who marries into the family, like this gentleman right here, if they're not affected by this particular trait, they're not going to be shaded in. So be careful when you're trying to determine whether or not something is X-linked or Y-linked, because you need to make sure that the trait is following a bloodline if it is Y-linked. Again, Going on to determine whether or not a pedigree is dominant or recessive. Okay, if the disorder is dominant, at least one of the parents of an affected individual needs to be affected as well, or you're going to find that shaded individuals or affected individuals happen in every single generation. If the disorder is recessive, you're going to find that the trait skips a generation, or if somebody is affected by the disorder, neither of their parents are going to be affected as well. So this is indicative that it's going to be a recessive trait. So just to review, from this video, you should be able to explain why a pedigree is used, what's the purpose of a pedigree. You should be able to identify some basic symbols found in pedigrees, although there are others than the ones shown. And as we go through pedigrees in class, if any of those come up, I'll let you know about them. And then from watching this, you should be able to determine if a pedigree is displaying a specific pattern of inheritance. Can you determine whether or not a pedigree is autosomal? Is it sex-linked, either X-linked or Y-linked? Can you determine whether or not a pedigree is exhibiting a dominant trait or a recessive trait? So from this video lecture, you're going to be identifying or practice identifying some pedigrees.